Become the parent your kids deserve with Gary John Bishop is what's coming your way today. I enjoyed my conversation with Gary, one of the world's leading personal development experts and the author of the New York Times and international bestseller, Unfuck Yourself. Gary joins us today to discuss his latest book, Grow Up, Becoming the Parent Your Kids Deserve. In this episode, we discuss being present, building authenticity, honoring your words, and so much more. Let's get this together. Gary, welcome to the Growth Guide. I'm looking forward to this conversation with you today on your book, Grow Up. For our listeners who may not be well aware of you yet, can you give them a brief intro into who you are and your background before we dive into your book?
Well, loosely described, I guess, what you might call somebody whose kind of expertise is in personal development and growth. This will be my sixth book on the subject of personal growth and development. I'm a New York Times bestseller. I've sold millions of books around the world. And I've been doing this for about the last, 15, 17 years of my life. And I'm out there. I'm all over social media and I'm talking to people and I'm inspiring people and, out to give people the tools to transform their lives.
So let's dive into your book with this question to get our listeners started. Being a parent is the single most challenging job you'll ever take on in life, is something you've written.
Right.
And whatever toolbox you think you've managed to piece together, for many people, there's just not enough in there to see them through it with peace of mind. Can you tell it, why is being a parent the hardest job any of us take on in life?
If you look at your life, in your teens and your 20s, which are usually the kind of decades before people start to have parenthood generally. I know people do it earlier, but generally, teens and 20s. Those years, in many ways, by the way, are about overcoming whatever your childhood might have been about. So, like, kind of transcending that and making your own way. And that includes, like, traumas and, self-limiting beliefs and all kind of stuff that you ended up with that you may not quite realize you ended up with. Then you do this thing. Perhaps you get in a relationship with somebody. Perhaps you marry someone, which brings its own challenges. And then you get into this thing called being a parent. And there's no denying it. When you get in there, the only template you really have is the way you were parented, which just brings up a host of stuff for people. Just like, it's like, Vesuvius, the way that stuff comes up. And, the best we can really come up with, if you didn't agree with the way you were raised or the way you were parented, the best you can come up with is the opposite of that. Like, I'm not going to do that. If you like the way you were parented, you're now hamstrung by trying to replicate that, right? Whatever that was, neither of which, by the way, will serve your children or you in the long term.
And you talk about an idea that brings up one of my favorite quotes on the podcast, gets used the most often. Carl Jung, until we make the subconscious conscious, we will forever be led by it and call it fate. And you were alluding to it a little there with the past traumas. So what we're looking at there is a lot of people, we're looking at our past and we start to tell ourselves stories about that past that then define us. And your point is, well, what happened. That's the facts. What you think about what happened is the story you're telling yourself. And that's part of what we need to learn to be able to let go to be a better parent. And a big part about that you talk about is this concept of blame and letting go of blame, whether it's others or ourselves. Can you dive into that for our listeners?
Yeah. So, blame's a funny thing. And I kind of give this kind of anthropological stab at it in the book, where you start to get like, if you get how human beings kind of started out and how we became really good at being human beings and being the way we are, blame is actually a really handy thing you have. Why? Because initially we're tribal and we're still tribal. We still want to hang with people who resonate with us in one way or another. And so that kind of notion of blame, you get like how we'd get really hardwired for avoiding sticking out in the group, or at least sticking out in a negative way. And so blame is one way where I can kind of, and you notice like we tend to blame in unison. We don't necessarily blame alone. We'll tell our friends about what happened. We'll tell our siblings or our loved ones, oh yeah, that's what happened. So we're looking for like this agreement to blame. And it does leave us with this kind of experience of being part of something, right? I mean, there are people who will just gravitate to what their friend says they're blaming. And even though they have no skin in that game, they'll blame too, right? They'll just go, oh yeah, I'll jump in with this thing too. So the way that kind of works out for us in our lives is blame isn't always obvious. It's not always like, A to B. Sometimes it's very subtle. It's the same with things like trauma. As people talk about trauma, like it's traumatic. Not necessarily. It's whatever intervened with whatever little world you were in at the time. Like whatever came along and kind of jarred that off track a little, that was a moment of trauma for you, which could be objectively traumatic, but maybe not. And so what keeps us stuck in those tracks is this both conscious and unconscious blame. So like the things that we know we're blaming somebody about, but then sometimes we're so embedded in the justification for it that we're not, no, this isn't blame. I'm just telling you how it is. This is really what happened. And I'll say, no, well, built in there, right? And blame isn't just, there's so much emotion attached to blame, or in my field would be ontology, but the ways of being that repeat and keep repeating in those cycles of blame. And so I don't give a dang what you do with your past. You'll never get over it until you confront your real connection to, and I call it an addiction to blame, because it's so automatic and it's so ingrained and it's such a destructive behavior. But that is your one way out of the past, is to confront who and what you're blaming and what you're getting out of that and how it plays out and explaining your life now.
And so, Gary, how do we do that? Do we look for those pivotal moments in our lives that frame us, that we hold on to, and ask ourselves, who am I blaming in this situation? And why am I blaming them? And what really happened at the core?
Right. So I don't use this example in the book, but I've used this example. And so I've done this in like different speaking events and stuff. And I'll say to people, in my teen years, I would have told you I was bullied. Okay. And that word isn't just a word for people. That's a world right there, right? When I speak in those terms, I'm inviting in a world right there. And I get all of the world, just not the little bits of the world that maybe apply to me. I get the whole thing. I get the weight of it, right? Being bullied, and included in all of that is who I am in that world, who people are in that world. And it just kind of like, it puts you in a certain kind of, again, ontological spot. You become the being associated with that. And so later in life, when I started to look back, I started to look at it in terms of, well, if I take away that word, because in that word, there's that person, and then there's me, and then there's my powerlessness and all that sort of stuff. If I go back in that world and I say, okay, let me look at what really happened. Well, this happened. He did this. I did that. He did this. I did this. He did that. He did that. And then I just simply looked at that for what that is. I was able to get a little bit of separation for myself, a little bit of space to observe it, to see it on its own right there, which could kind of throw a little into that kind of Jungian view of things, where you bring something from the darkness and you see it right there without everything I've added to it. And so for me, those were one of those really freeing moments, but it became like a mindset where I really started to pick apart how easily I add and I dramatize and I maximize and I end up burdened by it. So those are the ways, where you can pop in there and take a look and say, well, what actually happened? Take away everything, how I might describe it. What happened? They did this, they did that, I did this, I did that, and that's it. Usually in our story, there's their motives, what it was like for us, and so on and so forth. And there is one little piece, by the way, there's a little added piece, and it's a question I ask people. I say, if you continue with this story, what does it continue to justify about the way you live your life now? And in there, you'll see there's always a payoff.
Let's dig into that. So are you saying sometimes, for example, we may hold on to the story that I was bullied because that gives us a certain comfort, or people want to help us and be kind to us now because we were bullied when we're younger. So we realize we get a little pity out of it, if you will. So we don't want to let go of the
We
bullied
do.
label.
Right, we do, right? But I don't think everyone experiences themselves as that manipulative, right? I don't think we experience ourselves that way. I think we're just like saying, no, no, this is really how it is. But the reality is, if you look close enough, you'll see it does buy you something. You get to be the you that you've become through explaining it that way. And ultimately, that's what it's all about. And when it comes to that particular aspect of it, it's justifying this being that you've become. And when you've spent your whole lifetime justifying being, and people would say, well, I'm being myself. And I would say, well, what if that's not you? What if that's the you that's a product of all of that? What if there's a you there that you can't quite get to, right? What if this is in the way of that you? And so these are the ways of deconstructing, but that deconstruction, that kind of peeling back the layers, right, is often super confronting because you've built a life around it. You've become this persona, this thing, this element that exists. And this thing that you've become exists to perpetuate itself. So then it must keep facing the same kind of dramas, the same kind of traumas, the same kind of upsets. It attaches itself to the same feelings and the same patterns of behavior and over and over and over. And this is why often people do have that feeling of like inauthenticity, of I can't quite be myself. And sometimes the only kind of relief they get is through upset and anger. But I really feel as if the kind of work that you and I are discussing here, that's the juice right there. That's the gold for people. You get in there and you start picking that out and start really like laying that out in front of yourself. There's so much gold in there for people.
Yeah, whether it's psychoanalysis, whether it's shadow work, really getting into, as you would describe it, that first and second wave and figuring out, well, what imprinted itself on me that I'm not aware of it. And you talk about this idea that we don't deal in facts, we deal in our view of facts until the views and facts become one. Because for a lot of this stuff, we don't even remember what happened. We just have some vague impression early in our lives and it's imprinted.
Yeah.
But we don't even know the facts, do we, Gary?
No. I mean, look, neuroscience will tell you this. And I'm not a neuroscientist, but I've hung out with a number of them over the years. And, we had some brilliant conversations. And neuroscience will tell you, you don't have a memory of an event in your past. You have a memory of a memory. So that is, you have a memory of the last time you thought of this. And that's all the way down the line. So if this is recurring like 50 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times, you're 10,000 spaces away from where that thing originated. So even people might say, well, it's really clear to me now. I'm saying, yeah, that's called a grooved neuronal pattern. It's like you now closely associate the ways of being, which includes the emotions and the thoughts and the behaviors that are associated with that particular memory. So when that visits, it's one of those things, right? It's not just a memory that visits. It's like, it's all there, the whole thing, and you're in it, even though it might have been 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And I think the thing that I want people to really understand in this book is, I think sometimes when people hear the word trauma, they think, well, I didn't have any trauma in my childhood. And the way that I like to say to people is, just think of a newborn. Think of it like this newborn being kind of shoved into this world. How could you not be shocked by what you encounter? How could there not be moments when you're like, what the? Right? I mean, it just stands to reason. Like a child coming into this and in the first 15, 20 years of life, everything's new. Everything's like it's never been seen before and encountered before. And then you have to somehow work your way through it emotionally, psychologically. Of course, you're going to get stuck with something. Even if you think it's nothing, there's something. You just got to do the looking.
Well, when you say that, it reminds me, Gary, and I probably should have gone with this one right at the beginning, is whenever I'm talking to parents or young parents, I spent a few years in men's work communities as a member and then as a leader. And one of the things you realize with a lot of the young guys, because you generally do a mother exercise, a father exercise, no matter what we do as a parent, we fuck up our kids in some way. So whether we think we've done the exact playbook of perfect parenting, there's something that our kid, there's some story they've told themselves about something we did that leaves them feeling like we fucked them up. And you raise a
Right.
really good point that I hadn't thought about it. And it's shifting a little, but this idea that if you and I were born before the 90s, odds are our parents were under 25 when they had us. I have a 15-year-old kid right now. The idea of him having a kid in less than 10 years would scare the shit out of me. I mean, he feels like
Right.
a toddler right now. And so
Right.
this idea, we never look at our parents through the eyes of us as adults. We look at them through the eyes of, well, we were kids, they were our parents. But when you take that step back and you say, well, wait a second, like that dude was 25 when he had me, like he was
Right.
probably an idiot. So you take us through that exercise of
Yeah.
lens shifting and how that might allow for the forgiveness of our parents in a lens into how we parent.
Right. So one of the hardest things that many people face, I'm not saying everybody, and some people sometimes say, when I say what I'm about to say, when I create this, people, they go, I've already done that. But it's rarely at the kind of penetrative level where it changes your relationship to your parent. If you do this the right way, it will shift how you interact with them, how you see them, how you speak to them, how you communicate. It will shift the whole thing. If it's not shifting it, you've not gone in enough. And so, there was a point, and again, this was in my own development, but I really saw that I really only knew my 40 something year old mother, late 30s, 40-year-old mother, and late 30s and 40-year-old father. That's all I ever knew, right? But by this time, they're knee deep in a family. And at the time this isn't on my mind, I'm a child, I'm watching, I'm observing. I don't know the stresses, the strains, the trying to make ends meet, the bills, the job, the whatever. And then if you add in the potential that most people never notice, the trauma of their own parents, what they came out of, right? What they brought, like showing up there shiny and new at 22, 23, 24 and having a kid, and maybe a little hopeful about the future, but with a whole bunch of stuff on their back that they haven't even looked at yet and are likely never going to look at because they don't have there's just no openings for that from that era. So you're looking at somebody's humanity. And when you see your parents' humanity, when you actually see them as a human being and dealing with what they had to deal with and how they turned out and their efforts with you, whether they were good, bad, or indifferent, or terrible, what you need to understand is that was a human being functioning on the logic that they inherited. And their attempt was to either give you that logic that they inherited or not give you that logic that they inherited. And the way you were raised, that was the best stab that they could take at that, given whatever baggage they had. Again, that little bit of distance where you
Yeah.
can kind of let go of the character that they are in your mind and start to identify with a human being.
And Gary, the one thing you did, I believe it was your dad you were talking about when you were saying, well, here's what happened with him and his father when he was this age. And now you're not even just looking at
Right,
him as this young adult, you're looking at him as the child that he was and saying, well, how did
right,
that childhood of my father impact him as a man and as a parent? And so that ability, and we often found with young men that this was one of the steps they almost needed to take to be able to let go of that father wound, was to say, I can finally see my dad as that child. I can finally see his trauma, and how that imprinted him and how that imprinted the relationship I had with him, which was beautiful, and
Right.
even taking it a step further.
Yeah. I mean, it's something like somewhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 women, and these are the best estimates, were exposed to some inappropriate sexual interaction and as a child. Okay. Somewhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4. Somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 men. But again, that's the best estimates we can come up with. Had some inappropriate sexual interaction as a child with either an older kid or an adult. Okay. So the chances of your parent coming through their childhood with only that kind of incident in their childhood is relatively high, let alone physical abuse, mental abuse. The way that their parents loved them might not have been the way that they needed or wanted to be loved. Like, as your dad or your mom was making her way through their childhood, they were experiencing their own moments, their own milestones. But it feels like, we're the only ones that had those milestones, and then we become parents like, well, my children are not going to have milestones. Well, yeah, they are. You're screwed. They're absolutely going to have their milestones. And there's nothing you can do about their milestones, by the way. Nothing. Because you don't even know when they're happening, and neither do they. Neither do they, right? I mean, sometimes it's like a conversation between parents, and that child just says, my father's cold, right there. Or my mom's cold. Or my father's a bully. Or like that. And a moment, after that moment, it's a lifetime of gathering evidence. That's why when people get to a certain point in their development, when they're getting into their teens, and their parents are like, what changed about you? Yeah, well, there were probably a few moments back there where they gathered some evidence and you're on the receiving end. And I talk about that in the book too.
Yeah, we'll definitely get there, because it's when you're reading and then you look back and you remember those instances where you're like, oh, I had a fight with my wife and my kid yelled this, and it brings back the memory you talked about. So we'll
Yeah.
definitely get there, Gary. And something I appreciated that you talked about for you in a decision you made was, we like to talk about the importance of language on the show and in the writing that I do. And what you said was that from the singular perspective of I feel, because I'm unwilling to transfer the power of my feelings to someone or something else. I feel the way I do because I feel the way I do. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. And it's always the case. That's a really powerful paragraph to just kind of slot into the middle of the book there. Can you break that
Yeah.
down? And
Yeah.
how does someone transition from letting the world shape us to taking ownership of our feelings and our behaviors?
Right. Right. So two things. So the first thing is I endeavor to write books that are short and provoke you to think. I always say the value in the books is in the gaps between the paragraphs. It's not the paragraph. That's not the value. Then you'll just be gathering information. It will make no difference to you. It's if you pause and you stop and you write something down and you think and you ponder and you peel. When you do that, that book will make a massive difference for you because you were willing to do the kind of digging. If you just go through the book, it's not going to make any kind of difference at all. You'll just have more information, which ultimately makes no difference. What I wanted people to get there and really understand is how quickly we'll explain why we feel the way we feel. Right? So we want to explain it. So, might be, oh, well, you're always pushing my buttons. That's why I'm this way, right? Or, I had a terrible day today. That's why I'm this way. Or, I'm somebody who's never been good at dealing with X, Y, or Z. That's why I'm this way. And in every moment, in every single explanation or justification, or dare I say it, excuse, it's where I get to excuse myself for the way that I'm behaving or emoting in a particular moment. I get to excuse myself. In that moment, I'm actually giving away my power. I'm giving it away to my circumstance. I'm giving it away. I'm surrendering, right? Now, the interesting thing is when we talk about responsibility, it seems to me like we talk about responsibility of being responsible for how I feel, like suddenly I'll have to be responsible for how I feel. No, you're constantly being responsible for how you feel. You're just not always taking responsibility for that yourself. So that is to say, I'm making you responsible for how I feel. But I have to be the one who's making that call. Therefore, I am responsible. Even when I'm handing that responsibility to this situation or this person or this past. So I'm always coming from some sense of autonomy, but I'm giving it away, right? Now, I explain this in the book. It's a way for us to kind of get ourselves off the hook, either for the effort that it might take with intervening with myself in this moment of time, or finally saying, I've had enough of explaining myself through that lens. I'm done, and I'm not going to do it anymore. And that's why I say I am the way I am, because I am the way I am. That's it. And I own that. And I'm not blaming anyone, not even myself. I am the way I am. Now, from that place, I can actually do something about that or not. In both situations, I'm taking responsibility for the outcome.
In that important part, it's almost a differentiator there. I am the way I am because I am the way I am. But the fact that you said, but I can do something about that. So it's almost I am the way I am because that's the way I want to be. Because otherwise I would shift and take that autonomy and use it to say, well, this is the man that I want to be. This is how I want to show up for my children. So I'm going to change how I behave.
You've zeroed in on something really cool there for people that I do often with them. I think sometimes the best way for somebody to confront something is when they're boxed in. You have to kind of box them in a little. And it's only then that they'll take that turn, that little kind of mental turn in the direction of handling it themselves. It's when there's nowhere else to go. So when I say I am the way I am because I am the way I am, what I'm left with right in that moment is, am I going to continue or am I going to do something about it?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I am the way I am, right? And that is the way I am. But I think the next question is, the follows on after that. I am the way I am. And from here, what's possible? Who could I be?
Yes.
And then that's when your brain starts to kind of use this thing that we've long since forgotten, is the use of our creativity and imagination.
Oh, that's where the fun begins. So we've talked about the imprinting. We've talked about the subconscious, making it conscious. What we haven't talked about is this idea that you raise of when and how it happens. And you talk about that's the ages that we imprint and how we imprint in those eras. So you talk about 3 waves. Can you bring the listeners through the 3 waves at a high level, and then we'll dive into 1 or 2, and they can go do some reading for more of them, Gary?
Right. I think often people, when they look back and they try and kind of disseminate their childhood, for instance, they kind of want to do it in block, right? Kind of like in this kind of systemic, logical, one follows the other. And in my experience, that's not how it is. And I think the term that I said, it was life hits us like a wave, and it creeps in and it shifts things and it moves things and then it seeds back. But what is left there is mostly unnoticed by us. But then, and I suggest in the book, there are 3 significant waves. And they both are massive interruptions to whatever life was being lived just before the wave arrived. And so I describe the first wave is when one starts to get a sense of oneself, like that you are a you, right? Now, there is a time in your life before, quote unquote, you. So that is to say, the persona that you are, the characteristics that you regularly display and are associated with, and the behaviors. You weren't born that way. If you're analytical, you weren't born analytical. You became analytical as a way to solve something for yourself. Same with being competitive or being hardworking or being kind. You're not born kind. One becomes those ways, right, over time. So my assertion is that first wave is when you first get a sense of a you. But the sense that you get is really, it's almost like a moment in your life where you feel ill-equipped for you're getting presented with. That's why it's not necessarily traumatic. It's more like an interruption. It's more like, oh, I don't that, right? I don't know how to deal with that in that little mind in that first wave. And that would be in the first, 5, 7, 9 years, something like that. The second wave comes along. And again, there are 3 waves where this kind of, as you call it, this kind of imprinting takes place. And that second wave is when you start to look around. You start to take a little bit of a look around yourself here, and you start to see others. You start to see who they are. And you start to come to terms with that, right? For children, it's more often than not with their parents, right? So this is kind of like the beginnings of what I would call the end of innocence. It's like you're starting to really face some harsh truths. The first time you really see your parents and kind of question them, right? In that second wave, you're looking at your mom or your dad and you're like, it's like the image has changed for many people.
Yeah.
And then that third and final wave is when you finally realize that your job is to strike ahead, to get out, to do your own thing. And so there's this kind of separation that starts to take place between you and your family group, and which causes all kinds of internal upset and external upset. And the reason why I want people to get these 3 waves is I want people to get not only what perhaps their childhood was like and see it through that lens, but what their parents' childhood was like and see it through that lens. And if they have children of their own,
Yes,
you'll be able to accurately identify, oh, this is where my kid is right now. This makes sense to me. Like, rather than trying to put out little fires, you'll see that there's something afoot here that needs to happen. And really, it's your job to kind of ride it out with them.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy what you're hearing so far and want me to be able to get your favorite guests on this show, please do me a quick favor. Subscribe to the show and leave me a rating. The 30 seconds of your time will mean a ton to me.
And some things jump out at me as I think of those waves, to your point, both in terms of my childhood and then if I look at my kids. I remember whenever I think of my history, I kind of think of there was this moment in I want to say grade 5. So I'm somewhere in that 9 to 10 range. And it was this shift of my memories are of memories and to, hey, wait, like I'm a person and I'm making logical choices and I'm driving my life. And everything before that was just a vague memory. But it was that year where I started to feel like I'm a person. I'm me.
Yeah.
And I'm in charge of what I'm thinking. So it was beautiful that it tied into that. The second was, and I don't know if you saw this with your children, is I always say to other parents, especially because I went through that stage of being a workaholic and not being there. And up until 8 or 9 years old, you are your children's hero simply for being their parent. And then around 8 or 9 years old, and this tied into how you talked about cynicism, so I'd love you to tackle that. They actually start to look at you and you're only their hero if you're being their hero. If you're living in a way where they say, I'm proud of you, Dad, they lose that, well, my dad's the best dad. And I still remember when my youngest, he must have been around 8, said something along the lines, maybe 7, of, you're the best dad in the world. And his older brother, 3 years older, so he would have been 10 or 11, said, well, probably not. And the little guy's like, well, what are you talking about? And he's like, well, there's this many billion people on Earth. This many are dads. So mathematically, like this chump in the front seat being the best one are pretty low. And like just that, that exercise of cynicism from the older brother when the little brother is just eyes lit up. You're the best dad in the world.
Right. And, if I'm someone who my experience of being a child was that I was not loved, right? Or certainly not loved in the way that I thought I should have been. By the time I go to have children, the usual kind of logical step for that person to take would be to just shower their child with love, right? Now, you can imagine if your child's 10, 11, 12, 13, and starting to show an indifference to that, right? It's just kind of like, it's too much, style, come on. You can get how, as somebody who, my childhood was, my parents were unloving or cold or non-expressive or whatever it might have been, if that was how I would describe it, which is story, by the way, that's all story, to describe what happened and didn't happen, or certainly the things that I remember happened and didn't happen. You can get how now, if I've got this child who's indifferent to me, that's a problem. Now we got an issue in a relationship. And again, in the book, I want you to get, no, this is what's supposed to happen. They're supposed to get cynical, right? They're supposed to, like, why do we need cynicism? Because, again, it's a survival mechanism. How many times have you heard yourself saying, that sounds too good to be true? Yeah, that's your cynicism, right? Or when you meet somebody who's like super positive, yeah, I'm not sure, but that's your cynicism, right? Or, oh, what a great week it's going to be. Yeah, you think that's your cynicism. And it's there to kind of keep a lid on things, again, from that survival outlook, right? One, at a very fundamental level as human beings, being vulnerable and exposing ourselves as we get older, that's the last thing we want to do. Until we're really old, then it's all we want to do. But certainly through our 30s and 40s and 50s, it's about protecting, using the persona to protect whatever we feel as if needs to be hidden. And that leads you into the fundamental inauthenticity for being a human being.
And that's where so we're going to get into that authenticity. We've got a couple points before that. One of them, and you really beat home the harsh truth stick on this one, Gary, when you said, in my experience, young people, by and large, really don't listen, which anyone who's a parent knows. They listen to other people, not to you, even if you say the exact same thing. I mean, why the fuck should they? Most parents are hardly the radiant example of all that is good in humanity. And while they may not hear you, they do see you. And when your words don't match your actions, they can see right through your bullshit. As they're getting older, you're getting by on ever decreasing levels of credibility. Can you unpack that doozy of a paragraph for our listeners?
Yeah. Well, one of the things, I never suggest my books are an easy read, right? I know they're not. I know they're not. There's some confrontational things in there, but, you can do it on your own and no one's looking, right? It's just between me and you, so you'll be fine. You're not going to die. But if you just kind of look at it, again, if you think about the development of your child, this has to happen. They have to, their logic must follow their path, right? There must be evidence for them to break out and go in their own way, right? So if you just, again, think about this in terms of society and community, we're ever expanding, right? And we're ever expanding because at some level in every one of our childhoods, whatever situation we are in, it ain't it. It's not it. This ain't it, right? And so how do I untie myself from this thing that I was born into? Well, the quickest way there is to diminish those that are holding the ties that tie it. So I'm going to diminish them. I'm going to bring them down, right? And that's why a lot of personal growth work, by the way, for people when they're in their 30s and their 40s is to bring them back to those moments when they split. Yeah. Just to actually bring them back and see, well, that was necessary, but didn't have to be permanent, right? And then it often becomes permanent. But I really do want, some of the best personal growth work for people is when you'll see the moment where you fell out of love with your father or your mom. Like you fell out of love. It's like, I'm just not going to generate this for you anymore. And for some people, they did that when they were 10. 11, that's when it started. That's when the faucet became a drip until it just dried up. And then what you were left with is this kind of rudimentary, basic, how's the weather kind of relationship. But for everybody, once upon a time back in the early days of their life, like you said, they were your hero. You would go everywhere with them. The scent of them, the touch of them, the feel of them, it was all there. It might not have been the way it is in the movies, but it was there.
Yeah.
So what I want people to really understand is the break is supposed to happen. It's not something to be avoided. You don't avoid the break. You understand the break. And you see what your child is going through, because no one saw what you were going through when you were going through it. And no one saw it when your dad was going through it. No one saw it. It just looks circumstantial. You've changed. If you ask, in fact, you might even be able to do this with your 15-year-old. If you look back in the last 4 years, you'll see there was a pretty short period of time where your son just shifted. Like he was one way, and then he just went, chuk, chuk, and then he just kind of grew into another way. He's not the way he was when he was 11. He's not.
Yeah, 100%.
Right?
100%.
There's something new here now that wasn't there when he was 11. Yeah, that's when that cynicism probably started to kick in for him.
Yeah.
And then now he's starting to kind of get that autonomy a little bit, right? But that's a developing muscle. That's growing. That sense of like wanting to do it my way will only grow and grow and grow and grow. And again, if you tie it back to your parents, imagine what your grandparents were saying to your parents when they were going through it. Imagine what your great-grandparents were saying to your grandparents when they were going through it. Then you get why you were raised the way you were raised.
Yeah, and for, when you tie it to my son, like an easy example is you hit high school, you hit about grade 9, and all of a sudden you go to the homecoming football game, and a year earlier, your kid would have sat beside you, would have walked, grab a hot dog with you, chat with you. Right. Now, all of a sudden, he's over.
You're a fucking
over
embarrassment.
There. Exactly, right? He's over there with his boys. Yeah. And
you're a fucking embarrassment. He's looking at you, rolling his eyes.
Yeah.
Going, oh, shit.
Yeah. Just turns away. Like, I didn't even see you. And you're like, okay, I see you. I see. And right. To your point, I can take that as an insult, or I can say, all right, my boy's growing up. He's going through his thing. I'm gonna let him have it. I'm gonna let him have his space. I'll bug him a little about it later.
Yeah,
but I see it and I know it and I understand it, because it has to happen, right? Like we all go through that. Yeah. We all go through that phase where we're trying to. Right. You're my parents, but I'm me, and you need to give them that space of being autonomous.
Right, and I think because of the way we are, when our children are going through these kind of spaces, the automatic instinct is, this shouldn't be like this. So now as a parent, I might be like, well, screw you. You're just self-righteous and, ungrateful. And so there's the disconnect right there, right? And which happens a lot of times, by the way, with parents, right? And they'll even like kick their kids out and all kinds of stuff. Or I might be like, what's wrong with you? And this is a problem. And you don't appreciate this situation. And you need to understand what it's like to get. Rather than just letting them have their moment and it's not a moment, by the way, it's several years.
Yeah.
Right? It's several years of them finding their feet. And so I make this point in the book, like when you're raising children, the only thing you need to get good at making is space. You need to make a lot of space for their path and their passageway, not yours, theirs. You need to make tons of space for that. And you'll see, and you will see over time that the more space you make for it, and as parents were like, no, they'll go off the edge and they'll do this and they'll do the next thing. The more space you make for it, right, doesn't mean you can't have rules and you can't do things a certain way, but the more space you make for them to grow and find themselves in, the pathway to you is a very easy one for them to take. And that's probably the most critical thing. One of the most critical things in this book that I want people to get is, if you really want your job nailed down to the floor, it's to make the pathway to you the easiest one that your child can ever walk.
And so, Gary, I'm going to throw something out at you that happened here last week, because I'm up in my cottage. Last week, my parents were here. My sister was here with her family and kids. And one of the things we were talking about was a lot of parents will use a line like, I live for my children. And
Right.
what I said to my mom and my sister, because I think my sister is going through a little bit of a hard spot right now, because she
Yeah.
does live a little that way, and she's a teacher, and so that's a little bit wired into her. But now her kids are getting to
Yeah.
that age where they're going their own way. One of them's off to
Yeah.
college, one of them's a senior in high school, and it's like, hey, mom, like, we need our space.
Yeah.
And what I said was, they may say I take a more selfish approach. What I said was, like, I've never lived for my children. Like, I love my
Right.
children, I'm there for them, but at some age, they're gone. The only person
Yeah.
that's still here is me and my wife. So I live my life for me and for her, and make sure that there's that separation, i.e., got my passions, I've got my hobbies, so that when they're gone, I don't all of a sudden feel like
Yeah.
I'm an empty vessel. It doesn't
Right.
mean I don't love them, I'm not there for them, I'm not supporting them, I'm not, hey, when you need me, I'm here. If you want your autonomy, take it. But when you need dad's here. Just, say the word. Do you see that subtlety of, like, living for them versus living for you and being there for them?
I'll tell you why I'm there and what I would be doing there. And I want you to know I'm not there to interfere with your life. And in fact, if you don't come and see me at all through the week or at the weekend, that's fine. Right? It'd be the same kind of ground rules we have right now. We speak every other day. We'll catch up with each other, but that's it, right? Unless you want to do stuff with me, then I'm available. But I want to know what you think about that. Now, obviously, 5 years ago, we'd never have been having that conversation.
Yeah.
But the game has changed. I'm going into his world now. And so I'm fomenting this new kind of connection with him where we can be men together. And it's new for me, and I'm clumsy at it. I'm not good at it, but I'm aware of it, and I'm working through it. And I think that's another thing we're a little hesitant to do as parents. We sometimes feel as if we should have all the answers right now, and we don't. I've never been in this position before.
Yeah.
I've never had to speak to this kid like he's a man, and I've never had to try and, afford him that level of communication and authenticity. So I'm working my way through it with him, but I really do feel like I'm winning, like I'm on the right path. I really feel as if he feels as if I'm on the right path with him, because I'm not do this, do that, which I might have done when he was a kid, but I realize the game has changed with him, which brings up its own problem, by the way, because he has two younger brothers, and they're like, oh, the game's changed, and I'm like, not with you. Right?
Yes, exactly.
Because,
He's in a different spot
right,
than you are. He's 18 years
right,
old. He's in college,
exactly.
whatever he's doing. Like, it's a different,
Right.
he's a man now. You're still a boy. Right?
Right. And
Yeah.
so we have to dance that too with them. And it's being aware of where they're at again and that kind of unfolding of things. And again, you're not supposed to have it all worked out, but it's the right kind of game for you to be in terms of wrestling with the right stuff, as I like to call it.
And how did that end up? Did it end up well? Is the German move happening and you're headed to Germany?
Absolutely brilliant. Yeah? He was awesome. He was excited. He was like, this is so great. This is going to be perfect. I'll honor exactly what I said to him. Really rings in my head all the time, especially with him. But the path to me is something that's an easy one for him to walk. Like, there's nothing he has to overcome to come to me. There's no shame. There's no guilt. There's no pride. There's nothing. It's just a path, and he knows he can come to me, and there's no judgment. None. There's just an opportunity for him to be in communication. And, that aspect of my relationship with him and that I'm out to foment with his younger brothers is probably one of the biggest accomplishments of my life.
And do you think, Gary, now that you mentioned that with your boys, I look at a lot of parents who I know in Vancouver, Canada, who have financial means, their children will often go to Ontario or even Quebec for college. And how much of that is to say, because you could get just as good of an education at UBC as an example, but how much of that is them saying, I need my autonomy, and I get that autonomy by going to the other side of the country and just building in that space?
I would say it's significant. I would say it's not. It's probably most of why they've done what they've done, but I guarantee you a bunch of it is a fuck you to their parents.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
guarantee you. I
yeah.
guarantee. And it's, again, so what? Like, so what? Like, what were you expecting? You're like, really? Like, what were you expecting? Like, one of the things that I learned, when you have multiple children, you get this amazing insight into genetics, right? Like, why the fuck are they all not the same, right? They're all like really different, right? They're like, right? They are. They're just really different. And my middle son, when he was young, because my first son was like just this, good kid. And then when his younger brother was born, he was like this rebellious, not doing it, don't care, right? I'm just don't care what you say. And I was born and raised in Glasgow, and you better get in line quick, right? And then so I had a little bit of that early in his childhood, and then I thought, no, it hit me like, I like this about him.
Yeah.
I like that he's like, fuck you, right? Like,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
like that. He's only 4, but I like it. I like this in him because this is going to be part of who he becomes. Like, you can't push him around. He's not for pushing around, right? And he played this big, really important soccer game here for one of the big, massive, famous academies here. He played for them. And he played against this other really famous academy. And he's only 11. The whole thing was getting filmed, and there's all these spectators here. And, this kid like wrestles him and pushes his head, all off the ball. And my kid, he's this little American kid. He's new to this. And he just turned and went smack and just smacked the kid right in the side of the head. I'm like, oh my gosh, what's happening here? It's a disaster. And the referees were great. They're like, no. This is like part of their growing. It's part of their, like, they're learning, they're learning what works and what doesn't work. So, okay. And the coaches were great. But what I really got was, again, that thing where, he's definitely not that kind of kid, but he is the kind of kid who he'll stand his ground. And that was another thing I had to respect about him. And, it still has to work within the framework of the family and what we're building here. You can't just run around doing whatever the hell you want when you're 8 or 9 or 10 or 11. But there were definitely elements to those ways of being and those ways of acting that, yeah, I encouraged it, and I like it about him, that he's that sure about himself, right? Like, about how he should be treated. And I love that about him, and I would never try and take that away from him. And his younger brother's a whole other kettle of fish altogether too.
It sounds like we had the same thing with our first 2 boys, and I love the differentiation that for us, that was, all right, we're fucking done. And for you, it was like, let's have a third. So, because
I had to see if I could get it right.
like the second one is such a ball of energy. It's so like, holy shit, like how different are you? And we were like, okay, I think that's enough.
Right, because you're thinking it's a downward curve, right? You're like, what if it goes down? Like, it's
or even if it's the same, right? Like, even if it's the same, it's like, I don't think I have the mental, physical capacity to do this.
Yeah.
But it's just a blast. But I also say, Gary, that's partly on us, because like a simple example I'll give you that I use with young parents is like, when you have your firstborn, you're so anally retentive because, like you said earlier, you don't know anything. And so you've got this, I always use a soother as an example. So you drop a soother for the firstborn and you're like, oh, well, I've got to go take the soother, put it in boiling water, take it out and give it to my kid, sterilize it. The second one, you wipe it on your pant leg and put it back in their mouth.
Yeah.
Like you just,
the second one, you're taking it out of the cat's mouth and putting it in their mouth.
Yeah, exactly. And the third one, you don't even know where they are.
The third one, you're like, get it yourself. It's like,
and we don't appreciate like how much those subtle things shape each of them, right? So you're talking about your sons. Something I found beautiful was you shared an example of when you were on the road a lot. You were in Hong Kong and you got a call because your son was misbehaving at school, and you came into it tied to the stories and tied to the history of how you thought you should behave, and then you took a step back and you changed your approach and you came in authentically. And can you share a bit of that with our listeners? And there's 2 things you say about being that parent. One is how we speak, and one is how we listen. Can you tie that in for them?
Yeah. Being on the road in the way that I was then, I was, over 200,000 miles a year. I was traveling all over the world. And at this particular time, I'd found myself in Hong Kong. And, I was Skyping back and forth with my wife and son at the time. He was the oldest one, who only had one at a time. And, and generally he was just a great kid, just great, always, and I'd been on the road a lot and he was just awesome. As long as we could talk, he was great. And Mom, we come on the Skype call this one time and she's like, you got to talk to him. Here's what he said, here's what he did at school. And it was a nothing, but it was this kind of like flippant attitude with his teacher at school, which was first, it was like, what the heck? And I'd only been away for like a day or two at this point. I'm like, what's going on? So I get him up and his little face is right there looking at me in the camera. And I'm like, so what the heck is going on with you, man? And he kind of tells me the story. And I'm like, right, and I think he had a PlayStation at the time or so. I think it was a PlayStation. I said, that's it. No PlayStation for the rest of the week. And he said, okay. And I remember at the time, like, how calm he was bothered me. Like, it bothered me. Like, there he is. Okay. And I said, oh, yeah? Well, you can go straight to your bed tonight and, la, 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 la. Okay. I said, oh, really? All right. And I'm like ramping it up, right? And it was that moment where I actually caught myself. Because, at this point, I'm up to my eyeballs in personal growth and development. I'm getting way more aware of myself in moments of time. That's when you know the work's working, when you can catch yourself in a moment. And I caught myself. I'm like, what am I trying to do here? Like, I'm looking at like, where does this end? Where do I go? And now we're done, right? And this is all happening in like seconds as I'm sitting looking at him on that screen. And I realized I'm aiming for him crying, right? So I'm going to ramp this up until I see tears. And then I'll know I've hit the pain point. Right? And then we're good. Right? And it just hit me like, what an asshole. Like, what are you doing to this kid? You're going to, like, this is it now. He's going to feel it. And so I just stopped right there. I said, all right, time out. This is enough, okay? So, and that was when I had my moment. I really thought I just got to get my cards on the table. And the reality was I had no fucking idea what I was doing. Right? I didn't know how to deal with this other than the way that someone might have dealt with me when I was a kid. I didn't know, like, what would be a way, not the opposite of that, not that, but something else, just of my own volition, right? And I thought, I'm just going to fucking tell the kid the truth. So I said to him, look, you know how you're still kind of working at how to be a kid? And he said, yeah. I know. And I'm like, okay, good. I said, well, I'm still working out how to be a dad. And he said, I know, which fucking pissed me off again. So,
Yeah.
you're fucking kidding me? Like, you've known all along. Right. He really did. He said, I know. I was like, damn it, fuck you. And then I had this little, like, I don't know, just a moment of inspiration. I just said, what do you think we should do here? Right? What do you think we should do? And he said, I think I should write my teacher a letter and apologize. And then I probably should just switch off the PlayStation and have an early night. And he actually, I remember at the time he added a couple of pieces and it seemed a bit excessive to me. I was kind of like, no, let's pull it back a bit. Then it really did. It seemed like I was like, okay, that's enough. Right? So I kind of pulled him back a little bit. And he did it, and I was just so blown away by him. I was like knocked out by him. I was just like, wow, that's fucking, I'm like moved by it right now. I was like, look at this kid, this is wild. And I was proud of myself because I had taken an approach that no one had ever taken with me and no one had ever told me to take. That I just let authenticity do the talking. And the authenticity that I talk about in the book is that kind of authenticity. But you also got to bear in mind, when you're being authentic with your children, you have to be responsible for the kind of level of their listening. That is, where are they at? And are they in a spot where they can even hear this? Or is this too much for them? So you got to manage it and be responsible for the way in which it's going to land over there and how it's going to be received. But at the same time, from that moment on with my sons, I'm not afraid to acknowledge where I'm not getting it right. And I've told them, all of my children, I've told them, I'm going to make mistakes, but we're still going to do what I'm fucking saying, right? Like, we're not changing who's driving the bus. I'm going to drive the bus. I'm just letting you know I'm not always going to get it going in the right direction, but you have my word that if I find myself going the wrong direction, I'll straighten this thing up. And, I would say, without a shadow, without a moment of hesitation, the relationship that they've formed with me and the relationship that I've formed with them has been just outstanding, absolutely outstanding.
Which ultimately, at the end of the day, is we want them to have a good life, and we also want them. Something I heard that was beautiful was, I want it so that when my kid's past 20, he actually wants to spend time with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, if you take away all the noise, you take away all the drama and all the bullshit and all the stuff, and you get down to it with a parent, if you take away all the drivenness and building my business and my finances and my relationship with my spouse and take away all the noise, and you say to them, in simple terms, how do you want it to go with your children? Here's what they'll say. It'll come down to this. I want them to turn out. That's it. I just want them to turn out so that when I'm gone, they're good. That's it. And so all of the fucking scheming and strategizing and manipulation and fucking sleights of hand and all that shit is just for that outcome. Wouldn't you be better just focusing on the outcome rather than all the fucking methods that you think you're going to have to do to get that done? Right? The fucking analyzing and and the psychoanalysis sometimes that we do straight from fucking Google with our children. Like, stop that shit. Stop it. Right? You really got to authentically connect as one being to another. And in that honesty and that simplicity and that authenticity, that's the bedrock of connection. It's right there. It's the case with all human beings, not just your children.
Oh, I love it. And Gary, I'm going to throw some rapid fire questions on you. We'll end the book questions there. That's a great spot to tie up the book. So first rapid fire question, what's a book you've read that's had a material impact on changing your life?
I mean, I could anything by Steinbeck, but I would say Man's Search for Meaning kind of rattled my cage at a pretty young age.
That's how you found your moment. In that moment is our where we create the magic. I love it. Definitely changed my life too. I've spent the last probably 12 to 15 years trying to increase the gap between stimulus and response. So anyone who hasn't read Man's Search for Meaning, please do so. And what is one thing that you've bought for under $1,500 that Gary has thought, I wish I had bought this sooner?
Every $100 guitar that I've ever bought was worth the money.
So you have a collection of guitars, I'm hearing. I love that.
I got some guitars. I have a 58 Les Paul. I've got a 62 Fender Strat. I got some guitars.
Oh.
But some of the cardboard boxes that I bought for $60 were just like the greatest things that I ever spent money on.
Oh, I love it. And what's on your reading shelf right now? What are you consuming at the moment?
Oh my gosh, nothing that I would recommend anyone read.
Okay.
So I'm kind of digging into what I alluded to a little bit earlier, some of the works of Gadamer and Husserl and Heidegger and the kind of basic tenets of the early 20th century German existentialist view on things, which is it's not a good place to hang out. It's like torturing yourself in a lot of ways. But that kind of reading, for me anyway, the way that I read is I dip into the pond for a few days and then I put the book down and I just get on with life. And that's when the thinking happens. For me anyway, that's the way my brain works.
And so
I'm not somebody who can pour through things and get stuff right away. I can't. It just doesn't work that way for me.
And so is this research for a future book that you're thinking about?
Yeah, so one of the things that's been fascinating me for about 10 years is, other than all the other things that I've written, is why do we have the dreams we've got? And why are some dreams like not dreams for us? Like, why is that not on the table? And it's kind of interesting when you get into it, and very simple actually, but mostly it comes down to we do because we think we can, either because we did some version of it ourselves or we've seen somebody else do it. So even the people that are really going for big things in life, you're only doing it because you think you can. So the interesting thing for me is, what if you went for the things that you think you couldn't do? But what if that was like... And so that's a much harder sell for somebody. Like, let's do something you don't think you can do. Like, you think you've no shot at that. And in that, by the way, there's a ontological process that unfolds over time that you actually start to see, shit, I actually can do this. And so that's kind of like what I'm researching and piecing together, like the whole nature of that.
The other path, to your point, so you said you're only doing things that you think you can do because either you've done a variant of it yourself or you've seen someone do it, is this whole idea of, well, how do we increase your exposure to bigger missions or bigger dreams and bigger realities? And to
Right.
give you a simple example, even as I've, over the last 2 years, I've started growing this social media machine. And what I thought was possible and what my vision was when my account was a certain size, every 50,000 additional followers, you started talking to people and realizing what the people 10 steps ahead of you were doing. And it just increased the size of your dream because now you had exposure to what someone else ahead of you was doing. And so your vision of what was possible totally changed.
Right. You can't see mountains that are available to be climbed until you summit the one that's in front of you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a certain like victory that must happen. That you might think this is the thing you're facing right now. You might think this is the thing. Now, on the completion of that, there'll be a gap, little gap, sometimes days, sometimes weeks or months. But then what'll present itself, and it'll just
Even
present
bigger.
itself,
Yeah.
will be the bigger thing. You'll be like, oh my gosh, that. Now, if you go back 3 hilltops, that thing you're now taking on, not only would it seem like an impossibility, it wouldn't even exist like an impossibility because it didn't exist for you as a thing at all. Right? So
Yeah.
when I became an author, I had no intent of becoming an author. It was a mountain that presented itself after a lot of other mountains had been completed.
And when you try to explain to someone who hasn't gone over the first foothill what's available to them 7 foothills away, because you've ascended those mountains, and you're like, hey, here's what's available if you start, and they're looking at it and they almost can't even conceptually make the leap from where they are to what you're saying is possible because they haven't even gone over that first foothill.
That is true, but one of the most devastating things you can do for that person is tell them what's 7 mountains out.
Yeah, just tell them what's over the first foothill. Just say, hey,
It's like, because it's
if
all
you
about
get to
this one.
10,000, here's what'll happen.
Right, and that's always the thing. It's like you have to see the value in the mountain you're on.
Yeah.
You can't have every step here be about some, this is why it's such a fine line, and this is why it's so important to me. There's a fine line between your dreams and absolute detachment from reality fantasy. And so where do I get traction? Like, where do I get traction emotionally? Where do I get traction psychologically? Where can I find myself in such that this task that I've set for myself is not so distant that I just lose hope, but not so minuscule there's no challenge in it for me at all. It's a nothing. So what's the point anyway? So it has to be big enough, but somewhere in there, like, you must get some traction for yourself. And that is the real challenge, by the way, because it comes down to that same thing again. Do I think I can do it? And that's
Yes.
what I'm out to. That's what I'm out to unpack for people, is to get them to see. Let me show you the pathway to what you think you can't do.
I love it. It aligns with some things that I want to write myself. So when you're done that one, come back on. We'll riff on that one.
For
I
sure.
can riff on
For
that
sure.
topic with you for days. What is one mindset shift, habit, or behavior change that's had an oversized impact on your life?
The significance, the impact of what I say to myself I'm going to do. When I say I'm going to do something and I get into this habit of not doing it, I feel like shit about myself and I feel like shit about the world. And when I start to honor what I said, when I start to treat what I said like it actually freaking matters, I'm empowered and life works. And that simple little equation there, if you want to go from, like, in your mind, if you think you're a nothing and you want to be a something, if you just follow that little phrase that I just gave you there, that little group of sentences, and you just follow that, you will fulfill on everything that's on your mind and what will be on your mind.
Say what you'll do and then do what you say. I love it. It's beautiful. And we went pretty wide, reasonably deep on grow up. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you want to make sure you leave with the listener before we wrap up?
There's one little thing that I think people need to remember, that being present is an act one takes. It's not just there. That you have to catch yourself wandering into the future, drifting into the past multiple times a day. But the more you do that, the more you can, the phrase that I use, the more you can be here for what's here. And to me, that is the true essence of presence. It's when you're here and available for what's here, and to be curious about all of that and enjoy all of that and live all of that.
Oh, it's beautiful. And Gary, where can people find you?
My website is garyjohnbishop.com. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Threads. I'm still on Facebook there. And, one of the things that I really do like to do, you'll find a lot of stuff, especially on social media. I like to give people little bits of inspiration and insight and little nuggets of thinking. And that's something I do all the time. And then I've had my podcast, Unfuck Nation, has been on hiatus for the summer. That's something we're looking to bring back going into the fall. But there's hundreds of episodes there that people can dive into for their personal growth work, and to take that deep dive that we've been talking about today.
I love it. Thank you for joining me today on The Growth Guide. Really appreciate it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Clint. Thanks for having me.
Cheers.
If you like the podcast, you'll love our new newsletter, The Growth Guide. Every Thursday, straight to your inbox, with the goal to help you be better, achieve more, and become financially free. Check it out at our website, thegrowth.guide. Subscribe and learn more.